came across another claim that evolution was a myth and an attempt to show it in less than 50 seconds. Obviously, to debunk such a theory in such a quick time requires him to talk pretty fast. True, my older stuff I was a pretty fast talker, but I'm getting better now. Anyway, we're going to need to find some way to slow him down.
Where's the device that lets you speed or slow the passage of time? Under the seat.
Yeah. Where were we? Right, trying to dispute a highly substantiated theory in about 3/4 of a minute. Let's take a look. Where'd I put that?
The theory of evolution states that all living things come from a single common ancestor.
Not exactly. Evolution describes the change in things. Life could have begun multiple times, and current living organisms could have come from multiple individual biological startups, but this is unlikely. The genetic similarities of all living things points to a common ancestor. Also, if life was to form again, it would most likely be very simple and be overwhelmed by the existing life that already had billions of years to adapt and specialize over time.
Where the hell that single common ancestor came from? It doesn't say.
No, because evolution says nothing about how or where life began, only how it changes over time. In the same way that we don't need to know the elemental construction of water to understand fluid dynamics, we don't need to know how life formed to understand that it changes. How life began is abiogenesis. Now we have several hypotheses about how it could have begun. One that has a lot of support is Jeremy England's work. He proposes that due to the second law of thermodynamics, molecules could begin to self-replicate as a way to deal with excess energy. The process would create self-replicating molecules that would be naturally selected over time to become more and more complex, eventually becoming what we understand as life.
It is just a theory after all.
Yes, it is a theory, but not in the colloquial term of an educated guess. That would be more like a hypothesis. A scientific theory is much more defined. It must account for all evidence provided, not be falsified, and is able to predict outcomes. For example, due to our knowledge of evolutionary matters and geological history, scientists were able to predict at what locations and at what rock layer early ocean land animals should be found. And in 2004, those predictions were verified when Tiktaalik was found in the Canadian Arctic. Finally, something interesting happens in Canada.
That means that dogs, cats, elephants, birds, all the freaking trees, all the freaking plants, onions, tomatoes, insects, and humans all evolved from the same thing that existed way back.
Well, yes it does. Since it has genome sequences that are similar to both plants and animals, green algae is a very good indicator that both organisms from the animal and plant kingdoms had a common ancestor. Now, that split was about 1.5 billion years ago, which explains why plants and animals are so different. The further back a split was, the less similar two organisms will be. But it is still very likely that we share a common ancestor.
And how did we all evolve from this single common ancestor? Random genetic mutations and natural selection. Get your natural selection here.
I think I see one of your problems here. Natural selection is not something you can physically have. It's a descriptor of actions in nature. If you have two members of the same species, and one, for whatever reason, is more likely to survive and breed, they will outbreed the one that is not as likely to survive and breed. This is the selective process that will drive evolution.
This is what randomness looks and sounds like.
Yes, that is a random collection of static on the screen. What you're forgetting are two key points of biological evolution. One, the ability to self-replicate, and two, any kind of selective process. Let's say we took that random static and translated it into the corresponding ASCII code. Then we replicate it several times with some random changes, adding a bit of code here, removing it, changing a letter or two. Then we take a selection of some famous literature, let's say A Tale of Two Cities. If we take the children of the random code you started with and select the one that is closest to the literature, allow it to replicate, select the offspring which at that point is closest to the literature we have chosen. We continue this process over time, and after enough generations, we would have recreated the original novel.
Let's see. It was the best of times. It was the blurst of times.
Admittedly, this will take a long time, but each new generation will be closer. It must be noted that this is not completely analogous to evolution. In my example, there's a main goal that the ASCII replications are striving towards, whereas in nature, it is simply the ability to survive and breed that guides which traits are passed on with no planned end result.
Could random genetic mutations produce a freaking hand?
Yes, they can. Even a very simple organism that produced a pseudolimb to aid in movement or manipulating the environment in even the slightest way would put it at an advantage over its contemporaries that didn't have one, meaning that this pseudolimb would be passed on, being refined over the generations to be more and more useful. The organisms that evolved useful limbs would thrive over the ones that were less useful, eventually resulting in the hands that we have now.
Could it produce birds with wings that fly?
There are several advantages that would lead animals being able to develop wings. My paleontology professor was fond of the idea that wide arms and feathers developed to act as a net to help catch small prey. As well, a rough wing shape would be very useful, if not developing true flight, then helping an organism survive a fall. If they lived in areas where such a drop is likely, this survival trait would be passed on and refined over generations, resulting eventually in actual flight. And quite frankly, flight is a very useful adaptation. As soon as it was developed, it would quickly be passed on through the population.
Can it produce this fucking booty?
There are many evolutionary benefits to a fine booty. In females, estrogen encourages the body to store fat in the buttocks, hips, and thighs, with fatty deposits indicating a better breeding partner and having a better chance of producing healthier children. Basically, it's hypothesized that such a fine booty will have a better chance at having healthier kids, something that's passed on to the successful generations.
And then give me a brain with the ability to appreciate that booty?
Again, that can be explained by evolutionary means. If a fine booty is an indicator of a better breeding partner, the male of the human species will evolve the attraction to it because of the breeding capacity. In other words, males who have some genetic attraction to women with fine asses were more likely to pass on their genes, including that attraction.
I think whatever the hell made this shit and all freaking life must be a goddamn genius. Infinitely smart. All-knowing.
You can think that. There's no reason you can't make assumptions. But they're just that. Assumptions. What evidence do you have beyond thinking there must be an outside intelligence behind everything to account for the change in species? Things like the Lenski experiments have shown that organisms over time can change to better adapt to their environment. What can be shown to point to the existence of an infinitely smart, all-knowing being that is the cause of the diversity of life?
So yeah, evolution's a myth.
I don't see how you can possibly call it a myth when the theory of evolution conforms to all known observations. Again, no intelligence is needed to account for the diversity of life. We know that mutations will occur. That's been pretty much acknowledged since the beginning of agriculture. And we know that organisms that have a better chance to survive and breed will be more likely to survive and breed, while organisms that are less adapted to the biome they find themselves in will be less likely to pass on their genetic code. Add that up, and I can't see how you possibly call evolution a myth. Seriously, where'd I leave that? Come on, I got cartoons to watch.